Hi, I'm Jan, and I'm glad you've joined me for this fleece binding sewing tutorial. Can't wait to show you how easy and fun it is to use fleece and stretch knit to bind a lot of your sewing projects. I like to use these strips to bind a lot of my upcycled sweater projects. My hats and slippers works really well around the edges. It's nice and stretchy, and one of my favorite things is to line or edge a blanket with this cozy fabric. So you'll be using 2-inch strips of the fleece or knit. Sometimes that might be a little wider than you need, but you can always cut it off. So decide what color of fleece you need and cut out a 2-inch strip. Note how long you'll need depending on how long the project is. If it's a blanket, you're going to need several strips of. You figure out how length you need, and I'll show you how to join those together. You'll want to do that on the width, the stretch of the fabric. So fold your fabric piece in half and then cut out your strips. I like to use a rotary cutter. You can also use scissors if you need to. So I'm using, in this portion of the video, you can see how I'm using an upcycled knit shirt. And knit really works well. You need to make sure that it's a piece that doesn't fray. If the knit has a lot of cotton in it, it might fray. But usually a nice knit fabric will not fray, and you won't have to worry about it. So this is an upcycled t-shirt that I'm using. It has a cute floral print that works really cute on different projects. So knit also works. Make sure you're cutting it out on the stretch and that the edges are lined up. If the edges are not lined up, fold it in half and make sure, start with a nice clean edge using your rotary cutter and then cut out your strips. So depending on how big your project is how many strips that you will need, and I will show you how to join them in just a second here. So if you're working on a project that needs a long strip of fleece or knit to bind your project, you'll have to join the pieces together. You'll have to join some pieces together. It's really easy to do. So take your 2 strips, place them right sides together at a right angle like this. Overlap them 1/4 of an inch in parallel so that they're even and that it's just hanging off 1/4 inch, and you're going to be sewing from a diagonal from that little corner to the other corner. Take it to the sewing machine and you're going to sew a straight line from the corner notch to the other corner notch. Remove it from the machine and take your scissors, and you'll just cut along the edge, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Clip off the ends, and then when you open it up, the edges should be straight. Now sometimes if you're not sewing exactly in those corners, it will not be even. So you might want to practice with a piece first and see how it works. Instead of sewing just a straight edge like you think you would sew something together, by sewing it on a diagonal like this, it keeps the bias stretch, and it creates a lot less bulk on your final project. So now you're ready to sew the strip of binding to whatever project you're making. Now it's time to apply your binding strip to your project, whatever you're making, whether it's a blanket, a slipper, or a hat. Start by placing the right sides of the fabrics together, and you'll want to keep the fabric strip a little bit tighter than whatever you're applying it to, so there won't be any loose bulk involved. So you want to, depending on your project, and then the instructions will show you and guide you through that. But if it's on a straight blanket, just allow it to be a little bit more stretchy than the fabric piece, if that makes sense. So apply it straight on top and then maybe pull it just a little bit and then pin in place. If you're sewing it on a blanket and you have to go around a corner, bring it all the way to the end and then fold it at a right angle, keeping the edges flat and just making a diagonal and pin it in place. And I'll show you how to sew it. Start by just sewing a 1/4 inch, usually the edge of your presser foot, along the edge of both pieces of fabric. Or sometimes you're going to have several layers of fabric. Make sure that your edges are always even. So take your time as you sew. Remove your pins, sewing along the edge. And when you come to a corner, leave your needle in, lift up the presser foot, and pivot the fabric, the underneath fabric, around, and then reapply your binding so it's even with the next edge. Start sewing along the edge there. And you'll continue to sew until you get to the end. Now if you're applying if you're going around full circle on a project like a blanket and you're just using one strip and you need to join the strip, you're going to apply, you're going to fold the first edge over and then bring the end of the strip over the top, overlapping just about a 1/2 inch. And so that when you come to the edge, it will look like this. Clip if you have a corner seam, clip the seam so you won't have the bulk, and then you'll flip it over to the right side and see how nice that looks. Now you're ready to top stitch. Take your project and fold the seam towards the binding. It's really important that you do that the seam is folded toward the binding. You'll flip the fleece or the binding over the top and make sure that seam is sandwiched between. Pin it in place on the right side so that you can make sure that the edges are even. You just kind of work it with your fingers to make sure that that is the seam is on the inside and it's the width that you want. So you'll just go through your project, you go through whatever you're binding and pin it in place so that when you're ready to top stitch, you can just take it to the machine and I'll show you how to top stitch that. Again, make sure the seam is folded up. Just kind of work it with your fingers. You can really tell with your fingers whether that seam is where it needs to be. And don't worry, that will overlap quite a bit. We'll be cutting that off, and that's the magic of this technique. So when you get to the corner, you're going to fold it, pin it in place, and then pivot it, and you'll just fold it. See how that's at a diagonal there and overlapping, and then pin it in place so that when you stitch it and top stitch, it will just be perfect. You won't even have to use a needle and thread. Just continue on, and then you're ready to bring it to the machine and top stitch. You're going to be sewing, I call it sewing in the ditch, so it's just in that little crevice on the top piece, right where the fabric and the binding meet, right in that crevice. You won't even, most likely you won't even see your stitch. So take a time to place your needle right in that area and begin by back stitching and just taking your time, remove the pins and sew along the ditch. So on the corner, just sew to the edge, stop, lift up your presser foot while the needle is still in the fabric, pivot, and then continue on. And then just keep going until you're at the end of where you began. Backstitch, clip your seam, your threads, and now we'll clip the seam. So see how that's overlapping quite a bit? No worries. So sometimes you'll have bigger bulk and less bulk, so depending on how big you want your binding to be. Take your scissors and lay them flat so that you can trim along the edge there, making sure not to cut the fabric underneath. Use your fingers just to feel and get as close to that seam as you can. This is what's really wonderful about this, is that you don't even have to fold it underneath or do any top stitching on this side. So you're just laying your scissors flat and carefully cutting along the edge. And no worries about it fraying. So just take your time. You might have to go back in different areas just to make sure that it's straight and the edges are clipped nice and neat. So there you have a nice cozy finished edge, whether it's a blanket, a slipper, or a hat.